Hello, Petal. How are you doing? How are you getting on? Thank you so much for all the comments. I appreciate it. I really do, because it's nice to see what everybody's up to. So today we're going to be doing chapter 4, and it is a bit of a hefty chapter, so I might have to get into it quite swiftly. But I just want to send you all my biggest love and appreciation for everything you do and the fact that you're here. I just appreciate you so much, because it was a long break and it was just so nice that you all came back and you're like, yay! So yeah, we're going to do another chapter, and this one's 15 pages. So if you're nice, so have a cup of tea, have a nice cup of coffee, get yourself settled down, and we're going to have a little read of chapter 4 of Flying Dutch by our beloved Mr. Thomas Holt. The plump young man is now 2 years older and an inch and an eighth plumper, and he has become a partner in the firm of Memesdaily. Oddly enough, there were no comets seen that evening 9 weeks ago when Mr. Clough and Mr. Demaris told him the wonderful, wonderful news. The only possible explanation is that it was a cloudy night, and the celestial announcement was obscured by a mass of unscheduled cumulonimbus. These things happen, and all we can do is put up with them. Although they had made the plump young man, whose name for what it is worth was Craig Ferrara, a partner, they had not seen fit to tell him about the thing. Narrator's note, I'm doing really big bunny ears to enunciate the thing. Or at least they had not told him what it was. They had hinted at its existence, but that was all. For his part, Craig Ferrara had been aware that it existed for some time, ever since he had been allowed access to the computer files, generally known in the firm as the naughty bits. Memesdaily's computer was a wonderful thing. It lived, nominally, in Slough. Narrator's note, not a big fan of Slough, but rather like God, it was omnipresent and, of course, omniscient. Unlike God, you could telephone it from any one of the firm's many offices, and even, if you were a show-off like Craig Ferrara, from your car. You could ask it questions. Sometimes it would answer, and sometimes not, depending on whether it wanted to. Not could, mark you, wanted to. I'm putting an H in wanted right there, wanted to. Now, it would take a disproportionate amount of ingenuity to think up a sensible question that the computer couldn't answer if it wanted to, up to and including John Donne's famous conversation killers about where the lost years are and who cleft the devil's foot. And this despite the fact that the devil is not as yet a client of Memesdaily. But in order to ask the computer high-rolling questions like these, you have to be the right sort of person. Only someone with a number can get at that part of the computer. All that earthworms like Jane Doland can get out of it is a lot of waffle about the retail price index from March 1985. Narrator's note, I am still scarred for life about calculating retail price index increases for franchisees every freaking year. Oh, anyway. Not that Jane Doland hadn't been trying ever since she came back from Bridport. Narrator's note as well. I had a whole formula on Excel and everything, because I like Excel. Excel is a wonderful thing. It makes me happy. It's organised. Everything goes in nice little slots. But then when each one had a different sort of kind of like perk to the bloody place. Right. Not that Jane Doland hadn't been trying ever since she came back from Bridport. That, although he didn't know it, was the main reason why Craig Ferrara had become a partner. Also, narrator's note, thank you to Rose for this honey, because it is absolutely phenomenal and it really helps my throat. And not only that, I've got a big kilo tub of peanut butter which I've been gnawing on, which is quite nice. I don't know if you can actually gnaw on smooth peanut butter, but you can definitely nom on it. Craig Ferrara was only human, and so he would dearly have loved to find out what the thing was. However, it had been made unequivocally clear to him by Mr. Clough and Mr. Demaris that he didn't really want to know, and although in law he was now a sharer of their joys, sorrows and financial commitments, he was not so stupid as to believe that a mere legal fiction made him worthy to loosen the straps of their sandals should they ever behave so uncharacteristically as to wear such things. His relationship to the thing was that of ignorant guardian. If any member of his department started showing an unhealthy interest in anything to do with Bridport, he was to report directly to Mr. Clough and Mr. Demaris, who would take the necessary action. What that action might be, Mr. Ferrara knew not, but he had a shrewd notion that it would be the terror of the earth. A brief glance at the computer's call-out sheet told Mr. Ferrara that Jane Doland, the girl with the tin ear, had made a large number of Bridport-related inquiries of the computer in the last few months. most of them at times of day when she could normally be relied on to be hanging from one of those Daleks antennae things in a compartment in a tube train. That just gave me a real vision image. I dread to think what part of a Dalek that would be. This was exactly the sort of thing Mr. Ferrara had been told to keep an eye out for, and he felt a degree of pride at having immediately succeeded with the project his betters had entrusted to him. "Find us a mole," Clough and Damaris had said, and here one was. For such a fiercely passionate corporate man as Mr. Ferrara, it was roughly the same as discovering insulin. But accountants are not hasty people. Now it is not. Facts. They do not outwit their rapiers the moment they hear rats behind the arras. Smile and smile and smile and smile and be an accountant is the watchword. Before calling in Clough and Damaris, Mr. Ferrara resolved to try once more, utterly diabolical test. He would give Dorland the RPQ Mortifactors file. Now, the RPQ Mortifactors file, it should be explained, was where failed accountants went to die. How the affairs of a relatively straightforward small business had come to get in such a state of Byzantine complexity, nobody really knew. It had just happened. Like the British economy, the more people tried to straighten it out, the more it wrapped itself round its own intestines. Just reading through the horrible thing was enough to make the most young accountants run away and become wood-turners, but trying to sort it out was an infallible cure for sanity. Jane Doland was henceforth to be its custodian. Furthermore, she was to be given a month to produce a balance sheet and profit and loss account. Narrator's note. Although a degree of sadism went into the decision, Ferrara could never forget that Jane Doland was a girl who did not appreciate Wagner. It was merely a shrewd piece of tactical planning. Anyone with a month to sort out the RPQ Mortifactors file wouldn't have time to brush their teeth, let alone ask the computer awkward questions about Bridport or the thing. By the time Jane Doland had either succeeded or failed with RPQ, she would be so sick of sorting things out and investigating anomalies that she could safely be entrusted with the expenditure accounts of the CIA. Mr. Ferrara dictated the memo, smiled, and started to hum the casting scene from Die Freischutz. Please excuse me if my narration or my pronunciation is slightly off there. But I've got to say, balance sheets and profit and loss accounts, I don't know how many of you actually do your own accounts or how many of you have actually done accountancy, but dull. I mean, it can be interesting if you do forensic accounting and digging in and trying to find little bits and bobs and all that sort of stuff, but dull. Oh, anyway, it is galling, to say the least, to have been to every place in the world and then not know where somewhere is. It's rather like having a doctorate in semiconductor physics and not being able to wire a plug. You begin to wonder whether it's all been worthwhile. Vanderdecker typically blamed himself. Instead of frittering away his time and money on beer and scientific journals, he should have remembered that he was, first and foremost, a ship's captain and got some decent charts. Quite a few of the ones he still used had bits of Latin and sea serpents in the margins, and he defended his retention of them by saying that 1. He was used to them, 2. They looked nice, and 3. In the circumstances, what the hell did it matter anyway? Narrator's note. I am actually really hyper. Please excuse me. I haven't had enough tea today, I don't think. Since his crew generally lacked the intellectual capacity to argue with a man who spoke in bracketed Roman numerals, he had managed to have his own way on this point, but the short-sightedness of this attitude was coming home to him at last. He had heard of Doon Ray. He had an idea it was somewhere in Scotland on the coast. It's actually really nice and very pretty. That, however, was as far as his memory took him. After 400 years of existence, one's powers of recollection become erratic. Just as when a stamp collector has been going for a year or so, he will discard all the used British definitives his elderly female relatives have been clipping off envelopes for him and start buying choicer specimens. So Vanderdecker was becoming selective in what he chose to keep in his head. He rummaged around in his map chest and dug out a chart he hadn't tried yet. Unfortunately, it showed Jerusalem as being the centre of the world, and he put it back with a sigh. The next one he found was extremely non-committal on the topic of Australia, and that too was discarded. As it happened, Vanderdecker had been the first European to set foot on Australian soil. He had taken one look at it, said, "No, thank you very much," and had gone to New Guinea instead. Subsequent visits had not made him review his opinion. Narrator's note. I don't know why anybody would not want to go and settle in Australia because it's a phenomenal place. It's got really interesting and exciting flora and fauna that is all out to kill you. But if you survive, my goodness, you must be a pretty awesome human being. I digress. There was, he said to himself, only one thing for it. He would have to ask the first mate. Not that Antonius would know the answer, but it would at least put his own ignorance in some sort of respectable context. Antonius was playing chess with the cook on the quarterdeck. Vanderdecker saw that of Antonius's once proud black army, only the king remained. This was by no means unusual. Antonius had been playing chess for 3 or 4 hours a day for 4 centuries, and he still had not won a game.
"Antonius," he said, "do you happen to know where Duneray is?"
Antonius looked up irritably. His expression suggested that he had been on the point of perfecting a sequence of manoeuvres which would have resulted in victory in 4 moves, and that his captain's interruption had dispersed this coup for the 4 winds. "No," he said.
"Is it in Italy?" "Thanks anyway," said Vanderdecker. "I know where Duneray is," said the cook.
Vanderdecker stared. It was remarkable that anything should surprise him any more, but this was very much out of the ordinary. The last time the cook had been deliberately helpful was when Sebastian van Deurning had gone through a brief wrist-slashing phase, and the cook had lent him one of his knives.
"Do you?"
Vanderdecker asked.
"Yes," replied the cook, affronted. "It's on the north coast of Scotland."
Vanderdecker frowned.
"How do you know that?"
he asked.
"I was born there,"
said the only non-Dutch member of the crew.
"They've built a power station over it now. Typical."
Well, yes, Vanderdecker said to himself, it is rather. Miserable things tended to happen to the cook, probably because they were sure of an appreciative welcome.
"So you could tell me how to get there?" he asked.
The cook shook his head.
"No way," he said. "I'm a cook, not a pilot. I couldn't navigate this thing if you paid me."
The cook frowned.
"That reminds me," he said. All right, said Vanderdecker, "but you'd recognise it if you saw it again." "Maybe," said the cook. "Maybe not. How the hell should I know? Like I said, they've built a bloody fast breeder what's-its-name on top of my poor granny's wee croft, so there's probably not a lot of the old place left to see."
"Thanks anyway," Vanderdecker repeated, and wandered off to have a stare at the sea. It was his equivalent to beating his head repeatedly against a wall. On the other hand, he said to himself, as he let his eyes roam across the grey waves, the number of nuclear power stations on the north coast of Scotland is probably fairly small. All one would have to do in order to locate it is to cruise along, keeping one's eyes open for 3-headed fish and luminous oysters. And God knows they were not in any hurry. They never were. He walked back on along the deck, feeling that he had earned this month's can of Heineken. As he passed by the cook, who had finally and irretrievably checkmated the first mate, who seemed very surprised, he stopped and said, "Thank you."
"Forget it,"
growled the cook, in the tone of one who firmly believes that his request will be acted on.
"Just one more thing," said Vanderdecker. "How did you know they'd built a nuclear power station on your granny's wee croft?" "I saw it last time we were there," said the cook. "Last February, I think it was. I seem to remember it rained."
Vanderdecker didn't say, "Then why the bloody hell didn't you say so earlier?" And he said instead, "Thank you." Then he went to have another good look at the sea. Jane was feeling pleased with herself. Just when she had begun to think that her career was going nowhere and that she might soon be looking for another job, here she was with an important new file to look after. Not that she was particularly fond of her career, but it did help pay the rent, and she was enough of a realist to know it was probably the only one she was likely to have, what with the vacancy of the Princess of Wales having been filled and so many O-levels being needed for pearl diving these days. She knew for a fact that the RPQ motor factors file was something of a mixed blessing. Look at Jennifer Cartwright, look at Stephen Parkinson. In fact, you would need binoculars if you wanted to do this, since both of them had left the firm and gone to work in Cornwall after a week or so with RPQ. A hot potato with the pin out, as Mr. Peters would say. Of course, it would mean less time to try chasing up that strange thing she'd come across in Bridport, but that was no bad thing. Ever since she'd got back to the sanity of London, she'd been seriously doubting whether she'd actually seen all those curious and inexplicable things. There is nothing like a few trips up and down the Bakerloo line to convince you that nobody can live forever, and that the fierce determination to get to the bottom of it all had waned after the first few cracks at the computer. It stood to reason that if there was anything to find out, it would come up on the wire from Slough. Slough, figuratively speaking, was brilliant. Narrator's note. No, it isn't. You could ask Slough anything, and the answer would be waiting for you before you had time to blink twice. But she had found nothing. Which must surely mean that there was nothing to find, and that the Vanderdecker nonsense must have all been a figment of her imagination. The coffee machine was going through one of its spasmodic fits of nihilism, during which it produced cups of white powder floating on cold, grey fluid, and Jane decided to have tea instead. The tea came from a device which looked like a knight's helmet, and generally tasted as if the knight hadn't washed its hair in a long time, but Jane could live with that now her future seemed slightly more secure. It is remarkable how quickly ennui evaporates when faced with a rent demand. Her Snoopy mug filled, she returned to her desk and opened the RPQ file. Now, she read for about half an hour and found that she was almost enjoying it. Jane had a perverse curiosity about the people who had left the firm shortly before she had joined it. Had they still been there, and had she got to know them, she would doubtless have filed them away in her mental portrait gallery under poisoned toads, and that would have been that. But knowing them only from their letters and file notes, she was able to recreate them as they should have been. She knew most of their names, but some were no more than initials or references, and of course those were truly glamorous ones. She would, for example, have loved to know more about RS-AC-5612, who had passed briefly and intriguingly through the RPQ story like a Hollywood star playing a 3-minute cameo, dictating 4 letters and disappearing into the darkness like the sparrow in the mead hall. She pictured him. It had to be a him, as a tall, cynical man with hollow eyes and long, sensitive hands who had eventually turned his back on accountancy, started to write the great novel, and died of consumption. At the other extreme there was APC-JL, an old man, broken by frustration and disappointment, struggling to keep his job in the face of relentless youth and seizing on the RPQ file as his last chance to make his mark. There was a pathetic dignity in his last letter to Johnson Chance Davison, and the dying fall of his "We thank you sincerely in anticipation of your reply" moved her almost to tears. Jane suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She instinctively knew that the paper in front of her was different. For a start, it was handwritten, and the handwriting was erratic. It read as follows: The Vanderdecker policy. This has nothing to do with RPQ. This is a warning in case they do it to you too. I found out about the Vanderdecker policy, which is the proper name for the thing. It's a safe bet, whoever you are, that you found out about it too, or you wouldn't have been given this file. The Vanderdecker policy is important. It's so important that anybody who finds out about it gets given the RPQ file. That's how important it is. Sorry if you can't read my writing, but I daren't have anybody type this out in case they find out. That's why I've put this message here, in the RPQ file, because it's the only place nobody would ever think of looking except you, and you're only looking at it because they found out that you found out, which is why they gave you the RPQ file. I can't risk doing anything about the Vanderdecker policy. I can't tell you where to look or where or what. I found out. I'm getting out and starting a new life a long, long way away where they won't find me. Whatever you do, don't let them know that you know that they know. For God's sake, stay with it for as long as you can stick it out. Someone's got to blow the whistle on it sooner or later. It just can't go on like this much longer. It all has to stop. So just carry on. Pretend you don't know they know. Do something about it. If you've read this, please tear it out and burn it. Jane looked around, then tore the sheet off the treasure tag, folded it up and stuffed it into her pocket. Her heart was beating like a pneumatic drill. Somehow, she survived the rest of the day and took the train home as normal. Every few minutes, in the intervals of looking over her shoulder for murderers, she tried telling herself that this was just some poor fool who'd finally flipped after doing too many bank reconciliation statements. Narrators know, imagine doing 1,500 of those a month. It's not really that easy at all. I digress. But the name Vanderdecker was too big and too noisy to ignore. She packed everything she thought she could possibly need, plus a pot of marmalade and her hot water bottle with the woolly tiger cover, into her car and drove. At the first National Lombard cash dispenser she saw, she stopped and withdrew all the money the machine would let her have. If only she'd been sensible, she told herself, and not been put off by all those idiotic white horses in their advertising campaigns, she could have had a bank that wouldn't betray her whereabouts to Slough every time she made a withdrawal. The question was where to go, but the answer wasn't easy. She thought of her parents' house, but the thought made her shudder. Her father had succumbed to National Lombard Unit Trust propaganda 9 months after retiring to the Sussex coast. Surely they wouldn't do anything to hurt her parents. Better not think about that. Where else, then? Her sister had a National Lombard home loan, so that was out. Ever since she had left the world behind and taken to accountancy, she had alienated all her friends by boring them to tears with accountancy stories. Narrator's note, sorry. Only left. No. Yes, why not? It's a long way from London. Even idiots have their uses, even obnoxious, repulsive, pathetic little norms. She found a call box and fished out her diary. Fortunately, the local vandals had spared the dialing code section, and she located the code for Wick. The phone started to ring. It was answered. "Is that you, Shirley?" she asked. Shirley said yes, it was. Jane took a deep breath. Even when her life was quite possibly at stake, this was extremely distasteful. "Look, Shirley," she said, the very words were like a live worm in her mouth. "I'm going to be up near you for a week or so. Can I come and stay?" Shirley said, "Well, it's a bit short notice, isn't it?" Jane's fingernails were hurting the palm of her left hand. She fought herself and won. "Look, Shirley, I'm in a call box. I haven't got much change. Will it be all right? I'll be with you tomorrow. Afternoon. Sometime. See you." She slammed down the receiver quickly and jumped back into the car. Maybe being murdered would be better after all. Fair stood the wind for Scotland, which made a pleasant change. Indeed, it was nice to be going somewhere as opposed to just going, and Vanderdecker found the crew rather less tiresome than usual. The first mate climbed up onto the quarterdeck. He was going to ask the captain a question. Vanderdecker could hear his brain turning over like a coffee mill before he so much as reached the foot of the stairway. "Captain," said the first mate, "we aren't going to land, are we? When we reach wherever this place is, we're going to." "Yes," said Vanderdecker cruelly. As he had expected, this was beyond the first mate's understanding. Antonia stood very still for a while as the coffee mill approached maximum revolutions. "Yes, we are?" he finally asked. "Or yes, we aren't?" "Yes, we are," Vanderdecker said. "We are going to land." Antonius considered his reply and then looked at his watch, just to make sure. "But, Captain," he remonstrated, "we can't do that. It isn't time yet." "So what?" Vanderdecker said. "We aren't going to have a good time and get drunk. We're going to see if we can find that blasted alchemist." "But won't they just run away?" "Possibly," Vanderdecker admitted. "But it's worth a shot, isn't it? If we wait another 5 years, we may be too late. They may all have gone away anyway by then." "Oh," said Antonius, relieved to have been given explanation even if he couldn't quite understand it. All he needed to know in order to feel reassured was that there was a reason and that somebody was in control of it. Vanderdecker envied him. "After all," Vanderdecker went on, "we've got absolutely nothing to lose, have we?" "I don't know, do I?" said the first mate truthfully. "That's why I asked." "Take it from me," said Vanderdecker firmly, "we've got nothing to lose. If we're lucky, it could be the answer to the whole mess. If not, well, it makes a change, doesn't it?" The first mate nodded and went away. The coffee mill was still turning fitfully, but it would soon be still again. Vanderdecker, for his part, was beginning to have his doubts. What if the smell did drive everyone away as soon as they came within smelling distance of the plant? And presumably it wasn't going to be all that easy getting to see Montalban even if he was still there. He knew that all self-respecting governments are less than happy about the thought of members of the public tripping lightly around nuclear power stations or even coming near them in a disconcerting manner. Narrator's note, Tom Holt could see the future, just saying. Now, there was something about the sailing ship Verdonde that many people found highly disconcerting, and although its crew were invulnerable, the ship was not. Not that he felt any great sentimental attachment to his command, far from it. He hated every timber in its nasty, clinker-built frame, but if the Verdonde got blown out of the water by some overexcitable patrol boat, they might have problems in finding another one, or at least one sufficiently primitive that it ran on wind and not oil. Oil is hard to come by when you spend all your time in the middle of the ocean and smell perfectly horrible. Vanderdecker was still busy worrying himself to death, so to speak, with these and other misgivings when the lookout sighted Duncansby Head. This was Vanderdecker's cue to get out his charts and his sextant, since there were other perils to navigation in these waters beside patrol boats. For one thing, there were rocks and also sandbanks, eccentric and malicious tides, and sundry other hazards to navigation. It was refreshing to be doing some real sailing again, and the Flying Dutchman's mind soon became far too full with getting there to contain any worries about what he was going to do as and when he succeeded in this aim.
"If I remember right," said the captain to the first mate, "there's a little cove around here somewhere that we can hide up in."
It was getting dark, and Vanderdecker was worried about shoals. They hadn't progressed very far with their inch-by-inch search for Dune Ray, but progress was necessarily slow because of the need to keep out of sight. Now, a good skipper can plot a course that keeps him from being seen from the shore, or he can hug the course line in such a way as to render himself almost invisible from the open sea, but not both at the same time. Now, as it turned out, the Verdonde was seen by several ships and a fair number of landsmen, but none of them took any notice. They naturally assumed that the Fishfinger people were filming yet another commercial and carried on with their everyday tasks. Vanderdecker found the cove in the end, just before it became too dark to see anything at all, and the anchor slithered down and hit the water with its usual dull splush. The crew settled down to sleep, but Vanderdecker was too restless to join them. Somewhere out there, he might find the answer to his problem, and, although common sense told him that the power station was not something he was likely to overlook, he felt an urge to get off the ship and go and have a look about. He licked his finger to reassure himself that the wind was still out to sea, lowered the boat and rowed ashore. A brisk climb brought him to the top of a low, shallow cliff, and he walked down the slope on the other side. To his great dismay, he saw a building with lights in the windows, and the wind was changing. No good at all. He set off briskly in the other direction. How it happened was always a mystery to him. 1 minute, he was walking along the tarmac road. The next minute, a car came round the sharp bend, failed to stop and slammed into him. He went over the bonnet, bounced off the roof and slid over the hatchback rear end to the ground. The car screeched to a halt, and why the devil wouldn't you have done that in the first place, said the Flying Dutchman under his breath. The door flew open and the driver came running towards him. Vanderdecker groaned. Whoever this roadhog was, he was going to get the shock of his life as soon as he next breathed in, and served him right too. But it wasn't a he. It was a she. Very much a she, bending over him and looking extremely worried. "Oh, God," she said, "are you all right?" Vanderdecker stared in disbelief. Even he could smell it, and he had long since stopped noticing the smell, except when it was at its most virulent. For some reason, contact with dry land tended to make it even more rank and offensive than usual. But this girl did not seem to have noticed, or else she was being quite incredibly polite.
"I'm fine,"
Vanderdecker said, and stood up to prove it.
"Look, no broken bones or anything. You may have shortened life expectancy of my trousers a bit, but—"
A horrible thought struck him. He'd forgotten to change. He was wearing his old, comfortable clothes, which were very old and very comfortable indeed. The girl seemed to be having enough difficulty in coming to terms with his invulnerability, and as soon as she saw what he was dressed in, 16th century seafaring clothes, she would probably have hysterics. Fortunately, it was dark, too dark to see anything but silhouettes. Vanderdecker dusted himself off and started to back away, but he wanted to know very much why this girl couldn't smell the smell. "Are you sure you're all right?"
"Positive," he said. "Sorry to have frightened you. My own silly fault."
"Can I give you a lift anywhere?" the girl persisted. Vanderdecker remembered that they have funny little lights inside cars that switch themselves on when you open the door. He refused politely and said that he was nearly there. She didn't ask where. Thank God. "I still can't understand how you aren't hurt," said the girl.
"Luck,"
replied the Flying Dutchman.
"Fool's luck. Look, can I ask you a question?"
"Yes," said the girl doubtfully.
"Can you smell anything?"
"Smell anything?"
"That's right,"
Vanderdecker said. He hadn't meant to ask. It just slipped out, but now that he had, he might as well know the answer. "No," said the girl, "but I've got a pretty rotten sense of smell, so I'm not the best person to ask."
"I see," Vanderdecker said. "Sorry, I thought I could smell something. Can you tell me the way to Dune Ray nuclear power station by any chance?"
I'm sorry, said the girl, and Vanderdecker could tell she was staring at him despite the darkness. I don't come from round here personally. Actually, I've got some map in the car. Vanderdecker remembered the little light.
That's all right, he said. Well, I mustn't keep you. Bye-bye.
A moment later, and the darkness had swallowed him. Jane Donland stared a little more, realised that such an act was futile, and got back into the car. She still had 20-odd miles to go, and it was late. She'd missed her way at Libster, or had it been Thurso, just before she'd got behind the milk tanker that was behind the tractor which had been trying to overtake the JCB ever since Melvich, and she knew that her obnoxious cousin Shirley went to bed at about 6:30. As she drove, she tried to work out what was really unsettling her. Believe it or not, it wasn't the fact that she just run into a fellow human being at 40 miles an hour, or even the remarkable lack of effect the collision had had on her victim. It was the vague but definite notion that she'd met him before. Not seen him, but heard him a long time ago. An hour later, she pulled up in front of Cousin Shirley's bungalow in the picturesque but extremely windy village of May, put on the handbrake and flopped. She needed a moment to pull herself together before meeting her least favourite kinswoman again. She had hoped that when Shirley married the burnt-out advertising executive and went off with him to Caithness to keep goats and weave holland pea sweaters, that they would never meet again this side of the grave. She remembered something from an A-level English set book about something or other that had made the vile things precious, but she couldn't remember what the something was and let it slip by. She was just bracing herself to go in and have done with it when the door of the car opened. She looked round, expecting to see Shirley. But it was not Shirley. Perhaps now you are in a position to judge the significance of the fact that she would far rather have seen Shirley than the person she actually saw.
Jane Doland,
said the mystery door opener. A tall, fat man with grey hair and a face that did nothing to reassure her. She looked round quickly at the passenger door, but that had been opened too.
My name is Clough, said the door opener, and this is my partner, Mr. Damaris. We want to talk to you about Bridport.
The cat arched its back by way of acknowledgment to the sun and curled up to go to sleep. It had had a long day chasing cockroaches in the shunting yard, and if it didn't get 40 winks now and again, it was not good for anything. The live rail was pleasantly warm against its head, and the sleepers were firm under its spine, an agreeable place to sleep. The 1640 from Madrid is an express, and it doesn't usually stop before Cadiz. It stopped all right this time, though. It stopped so much that all the carriages jumped the rail and didn't stop slithering until they reached the foot of the embankment. It was a miracle nobody was seriously hurt. The cat took it in its stride, the way cats do. It wasn't in the least nonplussed by waking up to find an express train running over its head, and when the last sprocket had bounced off its ear and gone spinning away into the air, it got up, licked its paws, and set out to find somewhere a bit less noisy. On the way, it caught a large brown rat, which offered remarkably little resistance. It just curled up in a ball and squeaked once or twice. That had happened a lot in the last 400 years, and the cat found that it took all of the fun out of hunting. 3 days later, some men in gas masks lured it into a cage with a saucer of milk and some catnip and took it away to a large building with lots of clean white paintwork and scientific equipment. It was dull there, but the food was good and he didn't have to chase it if he didn't want to. The men in gas masks tried to get the cat to play with some very silly games with funny lights and big metal cylinders that went round and round, but after a while they gave up. A day or so after that, they put the cat in a basket, took it to the airport and put it on a flight to Inverness. Everyone was amazed that a man could exist and survive to maturity who would willingly marry Cousin Shirley. On board, since the idiot groom proposed to take her off to the northernmost tip of Scotland as soon as he had finished getting the rice and confetti out of his hair, everyone kept extremely quiet. Aunt Diana, in fact, attributes the arthritis in her fingers to keeping them crossed throughout the 6 months of the engagement. On the other hand, it seemed to everyone that Julian was a nice young man once you got used to him, and it really wasn't fair, and they ought to tell him, but they did not. Shirley was a sullen bride, and when Julian fumbled putting the ring on her finger, she clicked her tongue so loudly that the mother thought all would yet be lost, but the service proceeded to its tragic close, and Shirley went away. To judge by the wedding presents she received, 8 and open from her parents, a reel of cotton from Jane, 3 paperclips from Paul, Jenny and the twins, a paper bag from Uncle Stephen, it seemed likely that the contract would not be maintained between the newlyweds and the rest of the house of Dorland. Distance, however, is a great healer, and everybody remembered to send Julian a card on his birthday. Jane had obviously never been to see Mr. and Mrs. Regan in their new home-come workshop, only a long water shop from the romantic Castle of May, but she could guess that it would be like inside. Miserable. And it was. Cousin Shirley's greeting to Jane and the 2 senior partners of Moss Berwick were nothing if not characteristic. "You're late," she said. "Wipe your feet." Mr. Damaris was a tall man in his late 40s with the face of a debauched matinee idol. He had a charm, which on this occasion thoroughly failed to have any effect. His partner, Mr. Clough, just as tall but alarmingly fat, thatched with a sleek mat of senatorial grey hair and blessed with a voice they could probably hear in Inverness, also had charm. Astoundingly, Cousin Shirley seemed to like him, for she gave him a pleasant smile, and the 3 were permitted to enter. Jane noticed that Julian, who was sitting by the fireside, weaving something, had changed since the wedding, in roughly the same way as a slug changes when you drop it into a jar of salt. In another year, Jane reckoned you would be able to see right through him. His reason for giving up a thriving career in advertising in order to make the primitive garments out of goat's wool had not been a desire to test the theory that a fool and his money are soon parted, but a feeling that the pace of life in the rat race was wearing him out. Lord, what fools these mortals be. Jane considered, just for a moment, throwing herself on Julian's protection, asking him to send the nasty men away, but a glance at her cousin-in-law disillusioned her. His reaction to the intrusion of the 2 startling strangers into his living room was to say hello and go on weaving. Mr. Clough sat down in the least uncomfortable chair, Mr. Damaris leaned against the mantelpiece, and Jane subsided onto the footstool. She noticed that Cousin Shirley had left the room and thanked heaven for small mercies. If Jane had expected an awkward silence, she was all very wrong. Men who charge over £300 an hour for their time are rarely silent for longer than it takes to breathe in. Narrator's note, that's a frickin' fact, and then some.
"You weren't at the office today, then?" said Mr. Clough.
"No," said Jane. "I had some holiday coming."
"That's fair enough," said Mr. Damaris. "Next time, though, perhaps you should clear it with Craig Ferrara first."
"You didn't come all this way," said Jane shakily, "to tell me that, or were you just passing?" Cousin Shirley was back in the room again. She had brought Mr. Clough a cup of tea, just the one the cup. She hadn't stirred it, and the milk lay about 1/4 of an inch under the surface like a grey cloud.
"We're flying back to London tonight," said Mr. Damaris. "We'll give you a lift, if you like."
"That's very kind," Jane said, "but I don't want to put you out in any way." There was a shuffling noise, and Cousin Shirley was with them again. She was offering Mr. Clough a plate of very hard biscuits. He took one without looking down at the plate, popped it into his large mouth, and said,
"You've done well in the Bridport matter, but I think we should work together on it from now on."
Then he reached out, took another biscuit, and smashed the one already in his mouth into powder with one movement of his powerful jaws.
"I do think that would be best," said Mr. Damaris. "Don't you? Don't get me wrong, we're very impressed with how you've handled it, but this is something where we have to be very careful, don't you think?"
Jane had intended to fight, but her willpower had melted like a candle in the microwave. "How did you find me?" she asked.
"Right then," said Mr. Clough, standing up and smiling. "Now that's settled, we'd better be on our way. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Regan, and we'll be in touch about the other matter in due course."
This remark jerked Jane out of her comatose state. "What other matter?" Cousin Shirley gave her a look of pure scorn. "Mr. Clough is our accountant," she said.
"We're thinking of making the business into a limited company," said Julian unexpectedly, "but George thinks we should wait another year because of the tax implications." That, as far as Jane was concerned, was that. She went quietly. Mr. Clough explained it to her on her drive to the airport.
It was very simple. Moss Berwick were the accountants of the advertising agency where Julian had worked, and since the agency was such an important client, Mr. Clough had acted for them personally. At least he let his subordinates do the work, but personally attended to more important lunches. When Julian had decided to get out of advertising and into authentic knitwear, he had mentioned this fact to Mr. Clough over the Nouvelle Cuisine. Mr. Clough, whose greed for clients was pathological, immediately appointed himself accountant to the projected enterprise, obtained a cheque for £1,000 on account of initial costs, and handed the matter on to the YTS girl. Accordingly, when Mr. Clough turned up on the doorstep half an hour before Jane's arrival and started talking loudly about rollover relief and Section 30 elections, Julian and Shirley hadn't been at all surprised. They simply handed him a cheque for another £1,000 and believed everything he told them, the way people do when they talk with their professional advisers. "So, now what?" Jane said.
"Mr. Gleeson will explain," said Mr. Damaris.
Jane stared and was incapable of speech. Mr. Gleeson was the senior partner. Mr. Gleeson, it was widely rumoured, did the accounts for God. In fact, so the story went, it was Mr. Gleeson who first gave God the idea of organising the kingdom of heaven into a properly integrated group of holding companies. The idea of actually talking to him was more than Jane's mind could actually hold. "Really?" she said.
"He's waiting for us at the airport," said Mr. Clough.
While Jane's mind did another series of forward rolls, Mr. Damaris was considering something.
"I've heard people say," he said, "that you've got no sense of smell. Is that true?"
Jane admitted that her sense of smell was none too good, and Mr. Clough looked at Mr. Damaris.
"I think it's about time we reviewed your salary," he said.
Oh, what could be going on here then? Is it going to be a positive? Is it going to be a negative? Why did they go all the way to Scotland and specifically to her cousin's house to find her and bring her back? Why? What happened to her car? Where did she leave her car? I love this book so much I can't even tell you. I hope you're enjoying it, and I'm very grateful that you like my little narrator's notes, because it helps me it helps my flow. Because sometimes I go too fast, and I apologise for that very profusely, and it it stops me and resets me and blah, 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 sort of thing. That's just a little technical term. So I hope you enjoy this chapter. Just had to do it while I had some free time, and I really wanted to make sure that I used my free time proactively. And as you can hear, Ellie is shouting, and she's like, "I want my dinner," even though they started barking dead on 2 o'clock, even though I don't get fed at 3 o'clock until 3 o'clock. They're telling me and reminding me, don't forget, ma'am, don't forget, it's nearly 3 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, ma'am, it's nearly 3 o'clock, and we want our din-dins, please. Thank you. We will mend it, we will fix it, we will stick it with scissors and glue. Now, I don't know why I'm so hyper today. I think it has something to do with the peanut butter and the honey. Nice combination, peanut butter and honey. A spoonful of peanut butter and a honey buttermint tea. Heavenly. Right, okay. See, I'm trying to put some more energy in. See, this is the whole thing I'm talking about, being authentic. When I get online and I'm trying to record, if my headspace is not in it, I'm not giving you what you deserve. My best performance, as it were. So being able to give it a bit of energy and a bit of oomph gives it a bit more life and liveliness. Anyway, I'm going to stop waffling. So, I'm sure you know this by now, and I'm going to say it every time. If you could hit the notifications bell, put a little likey if you enjoyed it. If there's things you think I could improve, you're welcome to give me feedback, email or comment. It's no problem. Always love hearing from you guys, as you know. And I do try and answer as quickly as possible. And yes, so if you're too cold, wrap up warm and snug. Drink a hot cup of tea and get a flask of cocoa. If you're too hot, be well hydrated. Make sure you stay in the shade and you're not out in the sun for any longer than your skin will allow. Yes, and make sure you wear your SPF 50. Little note, by the way, if you see SPF 20, 30, 40, 50, that's not power. It's actually how many minutes it will last on your skin on average. Just saying. Oh, the industry has got me for life. I digress. So, I'm off. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon, Petal.